Hey, I'm Jess Ziegler, and this is Threaded Quilting Studio. Behind me, beyond my long arm setup, is the block we're going to be working on today. It's called the Mini Modern Heart, and I am the pattern author of that, and I have it for sale on my website. Right now it's only $5. I'm not going to promise it's always going to be $5, but it's just a $5 PDF download right now. I want to go through some of the steps of making it, and it's a really fun block. I love it in rainbows. I'm actually working on a block a day project, which kind of morphed into a weekly project. Like, I tried to get my blocks sewn 7 blocks in a week. I haven't been as disciplined to sit down and make 1 block a day like I anticipated in the beginning, but I still want to stick with it. I'm over 100 days in, and I want to show you some tips that I have for making this. And this is actually going to be a paper piecing tutorial. If you don't know how to paper piece, this is the perfect project to begin with because it's easy, there's not that many seams, and it's just ideal. So the pattern shows you how to put them together to make a baby quilt, but the blocks you can use for anything. So be creative. The quilt that I showed you behind me, eventually it's going to be a very generous twin size because there'll be 365, I think maybe 366 blocks the way I'm going to arrange it. I will show you how I've made the quilt in the past, these pictures. First of all, I want to tell you that there is a 1-inch test square on each page, and you would line that up with your ruler to make sure that that is in fact 1 inch. It is extremely important for this block and other paper piecing templates, or templates in general, that when you're printing them, you print at 100%. You don't want your printer to scale at all, or shrink to fit, I think is what some of the terminology is on the printer dialog boxes. We don't want that because then it's going to throw off our measurements for everything else. Some notes about the pattern. You'll see that the templates are on 1 sheet, and because I'm kind of an efficiency nerd, I have printed out 4 heart blocks per page, and I've printed several here because I am doing the year-long project. But I wanted to show you here, I'm just going to take a stack. Okay, there's 6 sheets here. Since all the blocks are the same and the page is going all the right way, I'm not going to staple or anything. I'm just going to make sure that my sheets are all aligned. And then I'm going to take a ruler and my rotary cutter. This rotary cutter is small. It's a 28 millimeter. It's been through about everything. I use it for both paper and fabric, so it's pretty dull. I don't mind cutting paper with this, but if you have an extra or an old rotary cutter, keep it around and use it for paper. It's a time saver for sure. So I'm going to align my ruler with the middle dashed line, and I'm going to cut those apart all at one go. And now I'm going to separate the top and the bottom, and I'm even going to cut the margin off of this one just because it's big. Which brings me to my second point. These cut lines, the dash lines, are not seam allowances. Okay? In a lot of patterns, you'll find the dash line or surrounding the solid lines to be seam allowances, but because I really wanted to shrink these and fit as many on a page as possible, you're just going to use that as a cut line, but do not trim on that line. We'll get to that step later, but what I want you to do is align your ruler and use your ruler as your true 1/4 inch seam allowance line and kind of use these as a guide. Okay, now I've cut these blocks, and just because I do like a very small margin, I'm going to trim up these as well. Then when I get to the sewing stage, I'm actually going to cut them apart so we'd have a left and a right half of each block. But this is what I'm doing to keep myself organized. I want an even representation of all the colors in my block. So what I've been doing on the back is just writing the date, the number, and the color. So I've got red, pink, orange. So This would be January 18th. This block will represent the 18th, yellow, and block number 109. And again, this is just so I can keep track of the colors that I've sewn and to keep my dates straight. I have a bunch of charm squares that I cut. Maybe you have a charm pack, or maybe you're collecting charms as well. I just wanted to show you how easily this project is to use with your charms. So for the parts of the block, so this is the left of the block, the right of the block, and then this is a piece that we'll add later. So with the charm squares, we want them to be used for these color bars. The heart shape, not the background. So to use charm squares is just super easy. You don't really even have to measure that well because this is going to be used in paper piecing. For the background, let's say we want a dark background, our 5-inch charm squares, and instead of cutting strips, we're gonna just cut them in half diagonally, and I'll show you how those get used in the block. And as with paper piecing, there is waste, and that's kind of the nature of it. There's not too much waste, but I find it's always better to err on the generous side so you're not having to unsew and resew, which is a pain in the you-know-what when you're paper piecing. If you don't have charms, don't worry. I'm going to show you what I'm working with, and trust me when I say it's a lot more fun and enjoyable for me to have some of the fabrics pre-cut, because this is what I'm working with. There's nothing wrong with this. I've kind of got this separated into clumps, but it's a lot easier and more fun if you just have your scraps at the ready. And I'm using low volume scraps for the background. Now let's go to my sewing machine. I'll show you how each one of those fabric scraps fits in to make this heart block. Join me. We are at the stage where we're going to begin sewing. First, I wanted to talk to you about pressing. I just use my fingers, my fingernails for finger pressing at each step, but I wanted to show you a few other alternatives. Okay, so this clover iron, you can keep it close to your sewing machine. And I just have a mason jar that I like to keep it in when it's hot. That way it supports the handle without tipping over, and you can have easy access to it, and it's not going to burn anything. And then I have a small travel iron. This one's called the Steam Fast Travel Iron, and it's been a really handy tool to have over the years. But I have found that my fingers work just as well and more efficiently. So I only use an iron to press when I'm all the way done. These are just the reds that I pulled. If my fabrics are way too wrinkly, I might hit them with an iron before I sew with them, but it's not a necessity. Okay, so I am starting with red, and before I begin, I'm going to cut on the cut line on the dashed line that separates the right half from the left half of the heart. And I like to start with the left. We're going to sew in order from A1, A2, 3, 4, and 5. First thing I need is a background fabric that will cover this shape here, A1, plus 1/4 inch all around for the seam allowances. So I have my scraps here, my low volume scrap. When I place my paper against my white sewing table, I can see the line more clearly. When it's wrong side up on my cutting mat, I can't see through very well. So you can also hold your template up to a light source so you can see those lines, but I can see it pretty well from here. So I'm just going to take a little bit of fabric glue. This is a Fons & Porter glue pin. The purpose of this is just holding my first piece of fabric in place while I make my first trim so I can get my alignment right. So the wrong side is up. I've put a little bit of glue. And now I'm just going to place a low volume fabric scrap over that A1 piece. And from the back you can clearly see that it's going to not only cover that A1 section, but we have plenty of room for a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides. I use an expired insurance card just because that's what I have handy, but there's an add a quarter ruler, I think it's called the add a quarter plus, that has a straight edge built into it, which is really handy. But what we do is we place the folding guide right on the first sewing line. So the first sewing line is going to be what separates section A1 from A2. I'm going to put my folding guide right there and fold that paper back. Then I'm going to place the add a quarter ruler with this lip on it. You can see it will shift on the folding aid and we'll trim away. So that adds our 1/4 inch seam. So now we know exactly where to align our first color bar. So I've got a really skinny red piece of fabric right here. I'm just going to use the first thing I grab. It doesn't have to be, you can plan yours more, but I want this to be really scrappy. So I am putting right sides together and aligning the edge with the cut with the pre-trimmed fabric that we just trimmed. So now I'm going to flip that over, making sure that everything is still in alignment. And I'm going to put that under my sewing machine needle. Now I have a 1/4 inch walking foot actually on my machine. You can use a variety of feet. You just want to make sure that you're going to have some visibility. A foot like this, an open toe foot, might be a really good choice for you, especially if you're starting out. Pick a toe that you can see where you're stitching because you're going to stitch right on the solid line. The other thing to make sure you do is to lower your stitch length on your sewing machine. I have a Janome and I like to paper piece at 1.2 for the stitch length, which is very, very, very small, and it will help me to remove the paper later. Another thing to keep in mind is having a new sharp needle in your sewing machine. Mine is a 90-14 needle. It's a little bit bigger and again it helps perforate the paper better and tear papers away. When you're done, I'm just using regular printer paper from my templates. You can use special foundation paper if you like. I tend to just use what I have. So I've got regular printer paper, I've got a short stitch length, I've got a bigger needle, and I'm also using So Fine thread from Superior Threads. It's a polyester thread, so it's very strong. But any thread, I mean, there's a variety of threads that would work for paper piecing. So I have my fabric and my template positioned right under my sewing machine needle, and so I'm going to sew directly on that first solid line. So you'll see in the template that the solid sewing line extends into the seam allowances, and that is by design. And we'll see later how helpful that is when you're ripping the papers out, but I have sewn right on that line. So now I just flip that red fabric, our first color bar, I flip that and use my fingernails to press that open. Not an open seam because you're pressing to the side, but you're opening that piece. So next, I'm going to trim up that first color bar that we just have sewn. I'm going to put our folding aid on the next sewing line, which is the solid line between A2 and A3. I'm going to fold that paper template back, place a quarter of add a quarter ruler, and then trim up that piece. This is kind of long and we don't need it that long, so I'll just lock that off while I'm at it. The other thing, I have this rotating cutting mat, which is a 12-inch square, and it's made by Olfa, and it's very handy to have next to your sewing machine for a project like this. So I'm just going to grab another scrap and I'm going to place it right sides together. This is a solid, so it doesn't really matter which side you have, but I'm going to align it with that trimmed edge, making sure that I'm going to have enough on either side for the seam allowance. I'm going to sew right on that solid line. And maybe you can hear that sound. It's my thread cutting button right on my sewing machine. That feature is really handy when you're paper piecing. You can start your next seam without holding and securing those threads. Continuing on with my third color bar. Before I place it, I'm going to trim up the last color bar that we just sewed. Just pulled this fabric out. I'm placing it, I can cut it down because there's no way I'll need that much. I'm aligning it with the color bar beneath, flipping it over, and sewing right on the line between A3 and A4. And now I'm going to place the last piece on this part, which is going to be a background. This is admittedly a little overkill for this piece. You can, I'm sure, find a smaller piece of fabric to cover that section. But I'm just going to align that with my last color bar. I'm going to flip that around and sew right on the line between 4 and 5. I'm going to trim a lot away. These are scraps, so I want to use them up. I'm going to set that aside for now and go to our next template piece, which is the right section of the heart. Like part A, you have B1, B2, B3, B4, B5. We're going to sew in the same order. I'm going to go back to my pre-cut triangles here, and something I like to do when I'm making a scrap quilt is try to get a different fabric for each part of the block. So we're going to start in the same manner as the last template piece, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue that is on the reverse side of the B1 template. We're going to put this fabric right side up, just kind of press that in place, and now we're going to trim that up so we can have a really accurate placement of our first color bar. So I'm going to put that on the line between B1 and B2, fold back the paper, place it at a quarter ruler, and trim. Now for the first color bar. This is a pretty big piece of fabric, but I'm going to place it just the same. I'm going to make sure I have more than 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side. I'm going to align it with our low volume background triangle that we trimmed. I'm going to flip it over. Under my presser foot, I'm going to sew right on the lines between B1 and B2. Again, I'm sewing off and on the line, the solid sewing line. I can just put this right back into my scrap pile because it's going to be big enough for another color bar down the road. Okay, now for the second bar on this side, I'm going to show you an example of this being too small. So I just grabbed this piece of fabric, and if I align it, it's not going to come close to covering the seam allowances on each side and the line. So this piece would be a good example of only what to use on the left side of the heart. This piece is much bigger than what I need, so I'm just going to kind of pre-trim it so it's not that awkward to sew with. I'm aligning it with the first color bar, and I'm making sure that I have a seam allowance on each side. The right sides are placed together. I'm going to sew that seam. If you have a knee lift on your sewing machine, this is a great opportunity to use it. You can keep your hands on the fabric as you're turning it and position it under your presser foot, and you can use your knee to lift the presser foot without taking your hands away from the fabric. It's really handy. Okay, so we're gonna trim between B3 and B4. Okay, this is another example of going right back in the scrap pile. Sometimes it feels like you never get through your scraps or that they multiply. And here is another piece of fabric. I'm just going to trim that before I sew with it. And now one more. And we want another low volume background triangle. Fabric is hard to tell what the right side is, and you can use both sides of the fabric. Nothing says you can't sew the wrong side up to get that effect. I'm going to use right sides together, aligning that with the color bar below, flipping that over, and sewing the last seam. This completes the sewing, the template sewing. We've got both the left and the right sides of the block assembled. Now is when I like to do my trimming. I am positioning on this rotary mat. I have a rotary ruler that has a 1/4 inch mark. Most of them do. You'll position the 1/4 inch right on the outer solid line. And again, this is different than most patterns in that most patterns will have that dashed line marked for you. But since this has a smaller seam allowance, we don't want to rely on those dashed lines on the pattern. We want to rely on your rotary ruler. Okay, this is just to show the fabrics do extend the template. That's what it looks like from this side. And now I remove the paper. So there was a faint amount of glue on this piece, but the reason I like this particular Fons & Porter glue pin is that it's tacky enough to hold it in place, but it peels away easily and doesn't leave residue. So now I'm just ripping out the paper, and if you have paper piece before, you know what a pleasure it is to remove these papers rather than, it's usually more difficult to rip papers out, let's just put it that way. So that is my left side of the heart. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to trim these up a little bit faster. So on my ruler, I've got a 1/4 inch going both across the top and to the side. So I like to turn my template so that it's horizontal. I like to align the 1/4 inch on each, so we're trimming 2 sides at once. And then the mat can be rotated, but I'm not in a great position to do that now, so I'm just going to rotate my piece so that when I repeat that step, it's trimming the 3rd and 4th sides at once. It's a little bit faster. Okay, now again, I'm just ripping my papers out now. So much easier to rip them out now than when you've sewn the whole block together. Okay, so in your pattern, you're going to have the dimensions for this part C. So if this is part A, this is part B, this would be part C, and those dimensions are in your pattern. We're going to flip right sides together, and I do like to pin at this step. The center of the heart is going to match up. So I only put 3 pins. I put one at one end, another pin at the opposite end, and then I match up that point in the middle. And you can sew it with a very short stitch length, but I like to lengthen my stitch length now that I'm not paper piecing. So I've got it up at a 2.2 rather than a 1.2. Got a 1/4 inch foot. We're gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam here. If you're making a lot of these hearts at a time, I would just batch, meaning I would do all the paper piecing first, then I would do all the trimming at one step, I would do the paper removal, and then I would sew these. But since I'm only demonstrating this one block, that's what I meant by this. The seam meets in the middle. Do you want to check your orientation of the pieces before you sew? The top bars should meet in the middle. The other thing to keep in mind is on the right side, that seam goes all the way up to the corner. I've seen a lot of people make these and flip them the other way around, and it still looks like a heart shape, and I guess you could use it the other way, but just be aware that's something that I look for is on the right side that goes all the way, that color bar goes all the way to the corner. Okay, so that seam is sewn, and now I'm putting in our part C, and I'm pinning this as well. And you probably should not pin or sew over your pins, FYI, even though I do. Another point I guess I'll make here is that I sew with these seams on the top and the smooth piece on the bottom so that you can sew it this way, but you put yourself at a risk of turning these seams and then it's not perfectly flat when it's done. So I like to sew with the plain piece, the unseamed fabric on the bottom. Now I'm finger pressing that seam open, and that is the way I like to do it. You could press to the side, it'll just be a little bit more bulky. So now I'm going to use some steam and a hot iron and really press that flat. Makes for a pretty cute block. So many things that you could do. You could work this into other pattern, make your own like small projects, table runner, wall hanging, oh gosh, any way that you want to use it. Can I share just one more thing with you? I have recently become a glue basting convert, and I just want to show you after the blocks are constructed. I'll show you how I've been seaming the blocks together using glue. I think it's really handy. I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so I've got a couple blocks here that I am ready to sew together. So in the pattern, I have you sew the blocks into columns and then the columns together instead of in rows. This is Elmer's washable school glue, and I've got a tip that I purchased from Pile of Fabrics. The tip just allows you to get a very small line of glue because it really doesn't require much. You can totally use just the cap that comes on, but I do like these glue tips. I think they're worth getting. So I'm going to apply a very thin bead of glue really close to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch in. Now I'm going to position the block right sides together, aligning my seams there. And once you've got it stuck, you can just heat set it with an iron for a couple seconds, dry iron. Also, I have an applique pressing sheet to protect my ironing surface from glue, and this is also heat resistant so I can press right on it. But let's do another block. Okay, we've got my hearts going the right way. Going to put some glue here. I only use this if I'm going to press to the side. It's kind of a pain if you want to press open. It can still be done, but you would just put a dot of glue like every few inches, and then once it's heat set and sewn, you can just pry that apart. It will work, but I prefer using pins when I open press. These two blocks I'm planning to press to the side. So these are heat set together. I'm gonna go to the sewing machine and sew those really quick and show you how nicely it works. Okay, I've sewn those seams, and now I'm going to use some steam just to get this nice and flat. Allows me to align my points really well, and there are no pins. So again, I'll just set the seam first, open that up, and press to the side. Really nice and flat result. So I will do a bunch of those at once. Glue, heat set, glue, heat set, glue, heat set, and then I'll get a stack, take it to my sewing machine, and just sew them. I really like glue basting for this process. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know. You can find me on Instagram at Threaded Quilting. I also have a closed Facebook group called Friends of Threaded Quilting. Just search for that and find us there, request to join, and I'll add you as soon as I see that. My website is threadedquilting.com. Under the pattern shop is where you can find the mini modern heart, and that's what we've been making today. Perfect for small scraps. That's especially why I like it. The cutting can be really fast. There's not that many pieces. The paper tears away so easily. I think it's really fun. So I hope you like it too. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for watching. Bye.